All right. In chapters 1 through 3, we talked about basics of statistics. Now we'll get into the actual probability portion of our ProbStats course. So we're going to start by defining what probability is. Okay. So what is probability? Probability is a numerical measure between 0 and 1 that describes the likelihood that an event will occur. Another way to describe probability can also be done through a percentage. So instead of saying 0 to 1, you could also say from 0 to 100%. Either way, either method is sufficient enough to describe what a probability is. Right. So, because of the percentage score and the equivalence between that and the measure between 0 and 1, the closer that the probability is to 1, the more likely the event is to occur. Likewise, the closer to 0 that the measure is, the less likely the event is to occur. So we talk about probability, we define it, we denote it as P of A, kind of like we would a function where P represents probability and A represents an event. Okay, so P of A denotes the probability of event A, and if my probability is equal to 1, that's 100%. Then that's a guarantee that event A will occur. But if my probability is 0, then that tells me that my event A will not occur, because that's a 0% chance of that happening. Now, the way probabilities are assigned, there are 3 different ways. They can be assigned based on intuition, they can be assigned based on relative frequency, or they can be based off of equally likely outcomes. Probability assignment based on intuition incorporates past experience, judgment, or opinion to estimate the likelihood of an event. That's more along the lines of if you want to talk analytically, it's akin to a qualitative analysis, right? Because it's not using anything concrete, more abstract things. But if you have a probability assignment based on relative frequency, that means you have what that is you have the probability of the event from the relative frequency, where it's a ratio between the frequency of the event happening and a sample of n observations. So you're basically taking the number of times the event happens divided by the number of total observations that you've seen. Another name for this kind of probability assignment is called experimental probability, because you're taking your probability based on experimental results, like the number of successful trials divided by the total number of trials. But then you have equally likely outcomes. Now, it's very similar to relative frequency, but it's more theoretical probability, right? As opposed to experimental probability. A probability assignment based on equally likely outcomes is again, it's a ratio. It's the number of outcomes favorable to the event divided by the total number of outcomes. In layman's terms, it's the number of outcomes that we want divided by the number of outcomes that are possible. So, for example, a sports announcer claims that Sheila has a 90% chance of breaking the world record in the 100-yard dash. Well, if went too far ahead. This could be more of the first one, which is the intuition, right? There's really like unless the announcer actually cites actual trial runs that support that, we can't say it's a relative frequency. Instead, we can only say that it's more intuition. Another example would be Henry figures that if he guesses on a true-false question, the probability of getting it right is 0.5 or 50%. In a way that makes sense, right? In a true-false question, there are really only 2 possible solutions. There's true and there's false. So there's one favorable outcome that we want, which is true, out of two possible outcomes, true or false. That is an equally likely outcome probability. The Right to Health lobby claims that the probability of getting an erroneous medical laboratory is 0.4 or 40%, based on a random sample of 200 lab reports, of which 80 were erroneous. So they base this probability on 200 trials that they've sampled, right, in which 80 of them were erroneous. That is a relative frequency-based probability. That's an experimental probability. Now, as as your samples get larger and larger and larger, right, the more and more outcomes that we have and the more outcomes that we test, it becomes more and more likely that the probability that we receive from those results will be consistent in future trials. This is an example of what's called the law of large numbers. In the long run, as the sample size increases and increases, the relative frequencies of outcomes get closer and closer to a theoretical or an actual probability value. Okay, so let's say that the probability that I hit a home run is 60%, and let's say that my sample size of me hitting the ball and getting home runs and missing home runs continues to grow. The amount of times that I whack the ball increases more and more and more. And let's say that my relative frequency now becomes 55%. So as the sample size gets more and more larger, right, then it's very likely that 55% probability will stay consistent, throughout future trials. So the law of large numbers, is a good reason that businesses like health insurance, automobile insurance, casinos, that's why they exist and make a profit, because they have so much volume of sample sizes to base their probabilities off of. So that's how they can really make a profit. In casinos, there's a phrase, the house always wins, because the probabilities are in huge favor for some of these games to the casinos. All right, so in order to come up with a probability, we need to conduct a statistical experiment. So if you want to know the possible outcomes for a particular situation, you need to define what that experiment is. A statistical experiment or a statistical observation is any random activity that results in a definite outcome. Then you have what's called an event. Okay, so an event is a collection of one or more outcomes of a statistical experiment or observation. So if I'm looking for the outcome of an event, I'm looking for the outcome. If I'm looking for the probability of an event happening, I need to find the probability of a specific outcome that I'm looking for. A simple event is one particular outcome of a statistical experiment. Sometimes an event can consist of more than one outcome, depending on the context of the experiment. But if you're only looking at one particular outcome, it's a simple event. Like, for example, for a true-false question, right? The probability of getting getting true as the correct answer, that's an example of a simple event, because it's only one outcome out of two different outcomes. So if you can collect all the simple events that are in your experiment, any possible events that occur in your experiment, that's called a sample space. So, for example, in the true-false question, you have two events, right? You either get true or you either get false as the correct answer. Both of those collected together, true, false, that's your sample space. Okay. Human eye color is controlled by a single pair of genes, one from the father and one from the mother, called a genotype. Brown eye color B is dominant over blue eye color. I think that's an L. Therefore, in the genotype BL, consisting of one brown gene and one blue gene, the brown gene dominates. A person with a brown-blue genotype has brown eyes. If both parents have brown eyes and a genotype B brown-blue, what is the probability that their child will have blue eyes? Okay, so according to genetics, there are four possible genotypes that are equally likely. So blue eyes can only happen. I'm gonna go ahead and annotate this. blue eyes can only happen if with this genotype, blue, okay? Now, there are the rest are brown eyes, because remember, brown is dominant, okay? So the other three possibilities for your genotypes are brown, blue, and blue, brown. So these are all equally likely events, or these all have equally likely outcomes. So what is the probability that their child will have blue eyes? Well, if it's an equally likely outcome, that means I need to take the number of outcomes that I want and divide it by the number of outcomes that are possible. So there are 4 possible outcomes, but only 1 that I really want. So the probability for a blue-eye child is 1 out of 4, or 0.25. Oops. I'm writing an 8. Or 25%. What's the probability that the child will have brown eyes? Well, these 3 are my brown eye babies, my brown eye genotypes. That's 3 out of 4, which is 75%. So when I look at these, my entire sample space, and I add up the probabilities of my entire sample space, I get something interesting, because 0.75 plus 0.25 is 1. 75 plus 25 is 100. All right. So human hair type is another genetic trait. Dark color is dominant and light color is recessive. Let's use the following key as a way to represent each of the hair types. If mom has dark hair and dad has dark hair, what's the probability that a child will have light hair? I mean, it's pretty much, you pretty much get the same thing here, right? Both parents have brown eyes and that genotype. Well, the genotype brown light. But again, it's essentially the same thing, right? They both have, mom has dark hair and dad has dark hair, right? So the probabilities will probably be about the same. But when we talk about the sum of the probabilities of all simple events in a sample space must be equal to 1, or 100%. We can also use this to determine the probability that an event doesn't occur. That's called the complement. The complement of event A is the probability that the event does not occur. And we denote it by A with a C as an exponent. That designates the complement of A. So what that means is the probability of A happening and the probability of A not happening, the sum of those probabilities has to equal to 1. But that also tells us that the probability of A not happening is equal to 1 minus the probability of A happening, based off of number 1. So if you want to find the probability that an event does not occur, another way you can do that is finding the probability that it would occur and subtracting 1 from it, or 100%. So here's A, here's my sample space, here's A, and here's the complement of A. So this is the probability of event A happening. This includes the probability of A not happening. Okay. The probability that a college student who has not received the flu shot will get the flu is 0.45, or 45%. What is the probability that a college student will not get the flu if a student has not received the flu shot? Well, that's a complement. We have to take that 45 and subtract it from 1, or 100%, and that'll give us 0.55, or 55%. So there's a 45% chance that a student will get the flu after not receiving the flu shot. Then there's a 55%, there's a 45% that the student will get the flu by not receiving a flu shot. Then there's a 55% chance that the college student will not get the flu if the student does not get the flu shot. Now, how is this related to statistics? Well, probability is where statistics comes from. It's, statistical work is done through probability. Without probability, statistics doesn't even happen. Okay. But there is a difference between, when it's appropriate to use probability and when it's appropriate to use statistics. And it's not much different from the difference between using a population parameter and a sample statistic. And it has to do with population and a sample. The field of study that makes statements about what will occur when samples are drawn from is known as a known population. Oh, I'm sorry. That's what probability is. It's a study that makes statements about what will occur when samples are drawn from a known population. Okay, so probability is more appropriate when we know what the population is. Statistics are more appropriate when we don't know what the population is. And all the data that we have comes from a sample. So statistics is the field of study that describes how samples are to be obtained and how inferences are to be made about unknown populations. So, for example, probability application is appropriate when we know what the entire population is. So, for example, if I know how many marbles of each color is in a bag, and I draw 6 marbles at random from the bag, I can use a probability to figure out what the chances are that none of the marbles that I chosen was red. But let's say I don't know how many marbles are in the bag. All right. So we only have samples from an otherwise unknown population. So when I draw a random sample of 6 marbles from this bag, and again, I don't know how many marbles are in the bag, based on the results that I have, I can make a conjecture about the colors and numbers of marbles in that entire bag. I'd be making an inference, an educated guess. So very similar to parameters in statistics, probabilities are more appropriate when you know what the population is. And adversely, statistical applications are more appropriate when we can only use samples instead of the population.